For early access plus exclusive content, facilitated discussions, live one-on-one Q&As, and more, become a patron at patreon.com/Bruce Poinsett. This is the Blacktastic Adventure, a virtual exploration of Oregon's Black diaspora, and I'm your host, Bruce Poinsett. On today's episode, I speak with Katharine Phelps. Katharine is a world citizen, educator, and mother of three. Her professional and service work is centered around early childhood education, literacy, and community building, with a particular focus on young children. She has taught in public and private schools in Tianjin, China, New York, Washington, and Oregon, and recently started her own small business working with young readers needing extra support in developing their literacy skills. Since September 2020, she has been part of a small and dedicated team that puts together virtual read-alouds for young children for the nonprofit group Respond to Racism LO. Katharine and I had a great conversation, not just about literacy, but also why it's important to center the stories of people of color and not just stories that focus on the civil rights era and are centered in trauma, but show and celebrate the full human experience. So I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Check it out. Hi, Katharine. Thank you for being on the show this afternoon. How are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you, Bruce.
Yeah. So we can just get right into it. You describe yourself as a world citizen. Can you talk about like what that means and kind of just like, you've been obviously you lived in all over the world. So yeah, can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yes. When I have sort of jumped around within the US and different continents. As a young child, well, I was born in Puerto Rico. Both my parents are African American and Caucasian, so I'm biracial. But both of my parents were born and raised in the Midwest, my mother in Chicago and my father in Ohio. And when I was, at some point soon after their marriage, they moved to Puerto Rico, which is where I was born. And then my father's work took us to Brazil. And I was in Brazil until I was around, I think, 2. So I only lived there a year or so. And then we moved back to the US for a short time. And then when I was 7, my father's work took us to Swaziland, Africa. And so my parents were eager to live in another country, in another place, because they wanted to raise us as children with an understanding that there's a wider world, there are different experiences to be had. And they really wanted a country in Africa. And that his work and that opportunity all lined up for them. So I was in, it's now called Eswatini, but at the time it was Swaziland, so I might refer to it as that all the time when I do. And I was there all the way through middle school. And so really my formative years were there. And a lot of my understanding of race and was shaped there because it's not far from South Africa, where we would go every year. Every year we'd return to the United States to visit family, and we'd often have to go through South Africa because of that's the airlines. The major international flights were through there, and so we would spend some time in South Africa and then there for both holiday and to leave for international flights. So I have a little bit of experience there, which was interesting because.
Excuse me, but
no,
yeah, during that. So that would have been during the apartheid era, right?
That's right. So it was during apartheid. And, my parents were an interracial couple. That was very difficult for them. But because I was so young, and my parents in some ways sort of buffered that experience for us, I'm pretty sure, because they'll tell us stories that I don't remember. I only remember, the one thing I can remember is going to a gas station and seeing 2 different bathrooms. So a colored bathroom and a bathroom for whites only. And, being biracial, I was like, well, which one do I go in? And I'm pretty sure I just went in the cleanest one. And so I didn't think anything of it. And I don't even remember if anything happened, the incident. I mean, nobody even caught me going into whichever one I went into. but I think that was the first time that it dawned on me that somebody was trying to make human beings separate because of the color of their skin. I think that it was not something that was a part of my consciousness or a part of anything until would be in South Africa. Otherwise, it would be, when you lived in Swaziland, most of the people around you were Black. So that is what, you knew. It was Blackness. There wasn't a lot of distinction between races. Now, I'm as a child, that doesn't mean that there weren't messages or signaling, because it was colonized by the British and it gained its independence in the late 1960s. So there were hierarchies and there were racial issues. But as a child, it was, most of my friends were of other countries were coming in as well. I lived in an area in a small town called Malkerns. And in my neighborhood, there were other people from other countries coming to do research in Swaziland. This is agricultural research. So they were there doing research or helping to provide help and assistance to the agricultural industry there. So there was a Korean family, a Filipino family, American family. There was someone from Denmark there. He was a bachelor. And then there were friends. My best friend was from Uganda. And so there was this whole mix of people living in this neighborhood in this remote area of Swaziland. So it was a different kind of bubble. It was a bubble, but we all just sort of were connected and together. And then after we moved back to the US, I was in the US for middle school, high school, and undergraduate school on the East Coast, which is far more diverse than here in the Northwest.
So where on the East Coast?
Maryland. So I was in Maryland, not too far outside of DC. So I would often go into DC, and I went to the University of Maryland for undergrad. And then, and I went, actually, for my first semester, I went to James Madison, which is in Virginia. And that's a whole, that's a whole other feeling, Virginia. But right after I finished undergraduate school, I was invited to come to China because I met someone at a gathering one evening in Maryland, and we started talking, and somehow she learned that I had done volunteer work, education work with kids while I was at Maryland, and she wanted to know if I'd like to come for a summer to China and do some English classes to help students who were coming into the elementary and middle school program. And so I was like, sure. I'd always wanted to go to China. I found it fascinating, but have very little knowledge and understanding. But right after I graduated, I was on a plane and found myself 6 weeks in China. And it was a wonderful experience. And when I look back on it, the principal, who is now a good friend of mine, was sort of like, yeah, we were sort of watching and seeing if we could recruit you, because we actually had a position open for first grade. And so they invited me to stay for the whole year to teach first grade. So I ended up staying a year in China, which was a fascinating country. And, but there was always something missing. Like, I was like, there's something off here. There's something off. And again, that was another bubble, because I was in an expat bubble, because expats, a lot of times at that time in China, which is 1997, 98, they would put foreign economic development zones in one particular area, and then the foreigners would live in that one area. And this was, the school that I was working at was actually for middle management, who were often brought in from Taiwan or Japan to come in. There were companies from Taiwan, Japan. So again, my classroom was filled with, and this was an English speaking school. So anyone who wanted to come from a foreign company often wanted to learn English as well. So a school was created that would be a full immersion program in English, but all of the subjects. So my classroom had, again, another Dutch student, a Japanese students, Koreans, and a Taiwanese student, and Americans as well, and Canadians. But they were small classes, and that was a wonderful experience. I really had it. But when I went back to the US for graduate school, I went to New York University for graduate school. The moment I came into JFK, I realized what had been missing for me, and that was like diversity, like in terms of even just like Black people. I was like, because I saw no Black or brown people in that entire year except for myself and one other staff member at the time. And I knew there was something off, but when I hit New York, I was like, that's what it was. That's what it is. And I had a wonderful time. Graduate school was great. I got my master's in education. And then I taught in Bushwick, in Brooklyn, at a public school in Brooklyn, did second grade there. That was a marvelous experience. I really enjoyed that. And the whole time that I was in graduate school, I was going into high schools and public high schools to do tutoring for math and English in Brooklyn as well. So that was really great as part of my assistantship. And after that, I returned to China again because they had another position. They really needed someone. And so I went back and did another year there. And from there, I had the chance to go to, I mean, I won't even do all the places I visited in between because I'll just talk about the places I've lived. And so China, and then from there, you know, going to different places from China, just Thailand. And when I returned, I stayed in the US for a half a year and then decided to volunteer for my religious organization, which is the Baha'i Faith in Israel. The Baha'i headquarters, the Baha'i World Center, is in Haifa, Israel. And they at the time needed some assistance, like admin assistance there. And I wanted a little bit of a break from teaching to see if there was anything else that might interest me. I had considered law for a short bit, but after being in the US and doing some temp work on that, I felt for me, it was more dry. It wasn't going to have the sort of, I preferred educating and teaching, like that, the action around that. And so when I was in Haifa, I was just going to be there for a couple of years, but I met my husband who was needed there for longer, and I ended up living there for 10 years. And my first two daughters were born there, and I spent most of my time at home with them, but would take part-time work in our legal office or doing some research or some writing for different offices when needed. But most of my time was spent sort of exploring and being with the girls, which was really wonderful. And we moved back to the US 7 years ago to here in Oregon in Tigard. And that's sort of when I started, and I would watch the news stories from Israel, from Haifa. I would watch a lot of the news stories. I would read the New York Times mostly, sort of see what was happening here around race. And I was like, what is going on over there? To see it from afar is really striking. You know, just sort of the brutality and the violence against Black men. And the one that when I first moved back that really hit my heart, that put me back in the classroom actually was watching, I think it was the young girl in Texas who a police officer, young teenage girl, slammed her body to the sidewalk because he was basically policing her tone. You know, she had said something to him in a way that he couldn't take.
That was the pool party run, right?
That was the pool party, that's right. And there was nothing she was doing that in my mind would have brought this out. And I saw what he did to her and my whole body, just the visceral reaction, like anyone, you know, anybody, whether you're a parent or not, but I think when you're a mother, you're like, that's my child, like could be my child. And that's what made me say, you know what, I want to be back in the classroom being on the front end, doing work around this. For me, that felt like the answer, like teaching, education, being around, helping kids as I could. So that's actually what, and by that time we had a third daughter, but that took me back to the classroom, and I went out to Vancouver, Washington, and taught at a public school there. The commute ended up killing me, so I stopped that job. But and then we moved here to Lake Oswego, and so we were in Tigard, I think, for 2 or 3 years, and then we moved here to Lake Oswego, and we've been here for 3 years. And it's a beautiful community. There's a lot of, it's the natural beauty's really nice, and the lack of diversity is bothersome. I hadn't really thought that about that, like reading I didn't really pay attention to the demographics, and that it really strikes you when you go in, when you work in Tigard in Vancouver, and then you move and you work. I taught here in Lake Oswego for a year. It was a great experience, a great class community, but you really see the difference in the communities. You really see it. And but anyway, that's my experience of traveling around and being all over, and sort of the highlights of where I've lived. And I've gone to lots of places in between, lots of experiences, enough to know that there's not one way of living and there's not one way of being. And when you have the opportunity to live somewhere else, you understand the constructs that are being created for you here in the United States and how ephemeral they are. You know, they're very real, but you almost have to decide how seriously you're going to take them. And it takes a long time to start to say, understand that this is all something systemic that's working at everybody, and we're all internalizing messages. And you've got to work really hard to figure out your place and your what kind of resistance, the form of resistance that you're going to take to it. But yeah.
I mean, wow. You know, I think that's a very important point to make about just like there's no one way of living, and like actually having that perspective. It's you know, you talked about sort of being in that expat community in China, and it's like I have some friends who've, you know, basically been like expat communities teaching English overseas, one in Vietnam, another friend who used to do that in Algeria, and one Black, one white, and their experiences were different. We'll just say different. I'm kind of curious, you know, you read stories about like different expressions of anti-Blackness in different parts of the world, but I'm curious as someone who's, you know, been in these different places, been in China, been in Swaziland, been through South Africa, lived in Israel, like, do you have whether it's anecdotes or just kind of like insights as far as like what it, like in your experience, what that's kind of like looked like?
Oh, being Black. You know, for me, I think a part of it is because I'm so light skinned. I have eyes that that look somewhat Asiatic. Wherever I am in Asia, they thought I might be Mongolian, so I would be called Mongoren, which is Mongolian person. And so that, of course, is a minority group in that region. And there are minority groups in China where the people are darker skinned. So my assumption is they probably assumed I was one of those if before I spoke. And then when they heard the English, they're like, oh, you're not even from here. I'm often thought of as Latina, like if I'm in another country, in a Latin American country, I might be spoken to in Spanish, or even here. Like my parents speak Spanish fluently, but I didn't pick it up. So sometimes that happens. I mean, for a lot of people, like, I think most people, when you're biracial, first of all, most biracial people can see when a person's biracial. And I think Americans are better at knowing when someone's biracial and probably what race they are, because we're so hyper attuned to race here. But I think the experience, the one experience I can think of that comes to mind is my oldest daughter. She is phenotypically white. So she looks like I married, my husband's white. So all of our children are also interracial. So they're all quarter African American at this point. And she's phenotypically white, as is my youngest daughter, but my middle daughter is just a little bit lighter than me. But I remember in Israel, so I had her in hospitals in Haifa, and I really do think the care I received might have been different because I was dark skinned. I do. I was one of the only people of color in the hospital, and I think that the way that I was treated, I felt it was different than some of the other women around me who were white. But I remember once being in Haifa and going to a video store, because those still existed then, and a DVD store, and walking in with my oldest daughter, who again looks white. And I go into this video store, and I've gone there multiple times now. I've gone there, I've been there for a year or two, and I've gone to the store many times, and now I'm coming in with my daughter, and the woman in the store, like the store owner, asks, so what do her, pointing to my daughter, what do her parents speak to her at home?
Mm.
Because she heard me speaking English all the time. I didn't pick up a lot of Hebrew. And I said, well, English. And I was like, but she's my daughter, right? She's like, what? No. And I was like, yeah. She's like, and the same thing would happen because my daughter had blue eyes. When I would go through a cash register, people could not believe that she was my child. And in the US, that happens a lot less. I mean, I think we would find it hard to believe here. And a part of it is because we know better. We almost know, like, don't go there. But I think particularly, I think communities of color know that there's a lot of interracial things happening from all the history. So you're not surprised when people can pass, or when people are, and I don't even, that term itself is problematic, but we know that there's all these hues, and it's other countries where they're not used to seeing that it's a little bit more pronounced for them. So I was always struck by people not sort of seeing the way that I was nurturing her and loving her. And I said to the woman, well, I'll tell you, if I'm a nanny, like, I'm the best paid nanny on earth, and I am the best nanny on the planet for this one. But I didn't take offense, because I understood where I was, and why should I be offended at being a nanny? That's in and of itself. But it was interesting. But those are the only two that come to the top of my mind. I'm sure that there are more. When I visited the Philippines in the 1990s, my brothers, who were a little more, one of them is dark, and he's actually adopted Brazilian, but because of his height, they assumed he was, any black males there are assumed to be basketball players or the military. So, and my mother, who's very dark skinned, would get stared at a lot, to the point where it bothered me, and I wanted to say something. I was like, you guys, to stop staring at her. My mom's like, no, they don't, she's sort of weathered all the different spaces around race. So she's like, don't worry about it. Don't even let it. But those are the only times that stand out to me as Blackness being noticed and being sort of either talked about, or it's clear from people's actions that there's something different.
Yeah. And kind of transitioning from that, you talked a little bit earlier about kind of like coming back to the States and seeing, just kind of looking around, and kind of like that sparking your interest to go even deeper into teaching. But as far as like what initially got you thinking like, I want to be a teacher, what motivated that? I'm curious.
I fell into teaching. I fell into it, which is surprising. On my mother's side of the family, my grandmother was from Louisiana, and my grandfather was from Mississippi, and both of my great grandparents had been sharecroppers. But my great aunt became one of the first principals in African American women principals in Louisiana, in a school district there. And on my mother's side, I have two aunts and uncles that are teachers. I have all three of my cousins are teachers. So and one of them is a principal, assistant principal. So everyone was in it and I wasn't. And I think it was the job in China. I was actually interested in going into either social work or into family therapy, because there had been alcoholism in my family. And so I was interested in learning about how to navigate those worlds and help people work through it. And so it was going to China and doing that summer job in China that gave me opened a whole other career path for me. And I liked it because it was less about reacting and more about getting in front of things. It was about creating. It was about forming foundations as opposed to having to always peel away something or work to take something down. You were creating and building up. And I really liked that. It felt very empowering, and it was enjoyable and pleasant to watch. And I particularly enjoy seeing younger children. I enjoy all the ages for sure, but younger children are just, those aha moments are so magical. And what you can see in a short amount of time, within 1 year, the changes you see are phenomenal. So I really felt drawn to that. And I sort of stumbled into it. And my father was who encouraged me to go on to graduate school as soon as I could, so that I wouldn't sort of let life take over. And I'm so glad he did that. He pushed me into that. And so I'm glad I did it. And I got it in education, my master's in education, and kept going for a little bit. I got a little burnt out. It can be a very stressful job, and it can be very consuming. And I didn't know how to balance things. And because I take it so seriously, because these are children and that this is their future that you're helping to shape, you feel a burden that that you might not with another job. But yeah, so I fell into it.
Yeah, and you recently made the transition. You were teaching in schools, and now you're an independent teacher, and really focusing on literacy. Can you just talk about, one, that transition, and two, like sort of the services you provide in your business, or your business journey so far, I should say?
Yes, I love the classroom. I particularly enjoy teaching reading. And I once COVID hit, I really was feeling it was a very difficult transition to make. It seems so normalized now, but it was very difficult for us teachers to be able to move everything we were doing online and keep that engagement super high. And I was easily working 12 to 15-hour days in that first month when we were transitioning, so that we could make sure the kids felt safe and they felt like that they were still learning and like I said, engaged. And it wasn't just 24 families, 24 kids, it was 24 families, because you now had to get everyone used to this new form of learning. And it was really I kind of burnt out, and it got a little bit easier toward the end, but easily it was 9-hour days. So, and that's what it normally is anyway. So then you add on, like all the other stuff you're having to learn. You're having to learn platforms now, and you're having to do all those things. So your weekend is spent on professional development to pick things up so that you can add more to the day for the kids. And so it was COVID coming, which meant all of my children be home. It was sort of the lack of balance that this transition forced sort of onto our lives. And then it was also listening to a podcast by two women who put a podcast called Black History Boot Camp. And they had done an episode on Ella Baker. And Ella Baker was really phenomenal. And I think I'm pretty sure this was the episode with her, but at a certain point, her granddaughter was brought into the interview, and her granddaughter started talking about how the idea of self-ownership was so important to Ella Baker. And so that's why she started her own paper, her own newspaper. And I'm pretty sure it was Ella Baker. If it wasn't, it was Ida B. Wells. But I was like, self-ownership. That sounded so good to me, to be able, because one of the most frustrating things is not owning your time and not being able to decide, who you're going to connect with, like, I wanted my days to have as much joy as possible. And for my days, the work I was doing to be joyful, because it's already stressful. I already have the burden of knowing that I'm responsible in part, not, of course, for this person's edification and where they're going to go, the goals we're going to set, and helping them to meet those goals. And I just felt like if I could have as much control over the process as possible, that would really feel, I would feel more aligned with where I was in my life at that time, which was needing more balance and a sense that I get to decide what the education could look like. And I had happened to 2 years earlier take a reading course that's often in a method called Orton Gillingham that's often used with students that have dyslexia. And it's a very structured literacy course. And that course really learning sort of the approach and the ways, it was a 2-week, 60-hour thing, and learning that form of teaching and learning, I was sort of like, I was very convinced that particularly for readers, I was always frustrated at not being able to reach the readers who are struggling in my classroom. Always, it would literally keep me up at night. And but this approach seems so clear that I decided that was what I wanted to focus on. I wanted to start to become better at learning what's called structured literacy, which is essentially phonics, like phonics and encoding, which is spelling, and helping kids to make those connections. Because kids who are struggling, that's actually what the problem is that they need more time and more exposure to the rules and the patterns of the language that they're having trouble reading and writing. And there really is an order to it. There really is a way that you can sort of develop their skills and build upon them in a very structured way, using all of their senses, because for some kids, they need it in more than one way, and they also need to spend more time producing it in some way. And so I was really attracted to that. It felt intuitively right. And so I decided to start my own business where I would do one-on-one work, and of course, virtually with COVID, one-on-one work with students who were behind in their reading. And it's been fantastic. And a private school that focuses primarily in that work actually hired me a couple of months ago to just come in and do one group for them, because they needed somebody just to come in for one small group of kids. And so I do part-time work for that academy and then have my own clients. And that's been wonderful to kind of be able to fit my family into the schedule without feeling so stretched. And it gives me a little bit more space and room to do community service and other things that I feel are important.
Yeah, and that's, you talk about self-ownership and being able to, create a situation where you can, one, do your work in a way that is not just, killing you, for lack of better terms, but then also being able to do these other things. Because I imagine, as like you were, a Black teacher in LO schools for a little bit. So I imagine people were like, no, you can't leave. Don't leave. I haven't been there for these conversations, but I have a feeling someone has probably mentioned that to you once or twice before. So, But at the same time, you have this being able to, again, do this work in a way that, serves people, but also, serves yourself. And I think oftentimes we don't talk about, we have more language around self-care now than we probably ever have. But still, when it comes to doing this work in a way that's sustainable, in a way where it's
Right,
like we don't just have to, martyr ourselves
right.
because, or feel this obligation to martyr ourselves, because I think that's, again, it's not
Yeah,
sustainable. It's detrimental. It's also, it puts the burden, not to mention, it just puts the burden when we talk specifically about things like racial justice and empowering marginalized communities, it puts the burden on the marginalized and not the
that's
people
right.
who, make these systems. So I think, it's very powerful to, like I said, own your thing and do it and model that for others to do. So,
Yes, yes,
congrats on that. And, I appreciate, people like yourself, especially, because it's one thing in, like, Portland or bigger metro areas or more diverse areas. you know it's funny, we're talking about, you talked about going from Tigard in Vancouver to LO, and it's kind of like these places that are not exactly bastions of diversity, but just relatively speaking,
yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah,
another funny story. But you know being able to do that, especially modeling that in places, again, like LO, in Tigard, places where it's like people are, you know, at least claim they're new to these conversations, is very crucial in this moment, because, like you said, it helps build foundation. It helps give an example for these students, honestly, and these young people who, are trying to figure it out as they go right now. So yeah, that's very important. And, I think just in our
yeah.
conversations, we're going to get into some of the organizing stuff and respond to racism in a little bit. But, you know, we just, I think, one of the ways we've really like connected is just like we share a passion for literacy.
Yes,
And, when you talked about just working, especially with younger kids, like that really hit me, because like I just, several years ago, started doing like just some volunteer reading through the SMART program. And I get that same feeling of just like being able, even in just a very loose setting where you're reading with kindergartners, but you do see the growth, you see the interest, you see, you know, those aha moments. And it's
yes.
like, yes, this is what this is about. So can you talk a little bit about, the the importance of building that foundation around literacy specifically, but then just I'm not sure, like, if you have any particular aha moments that, you know, have stood out to you, or stories or anecdotes you wanted to share. Yeah. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yes, yes. Everything you said is very powerful, as usual. um, yeah, I think that we most certainly live in a literate world, and um, and literacy in the broadest way could mean a facility with knowledge, a facility with understanding the world around you, and um, being able to connect to it in some way. And so, even if perhaps you're still struggling to read, or you're still learning a particular language, there, having access to knowledge is really important. Um, and being able to read, particularly in a world where whether it's print or media, is so crucial to one's being able to navigate their own community, that it's a disservice when we're failing to help our um, our students that struggle the most with having that access, being able to do that. Because, and it's not only to survive, you being able to read, just fill out an application,
Mhm.
just, I'm not even talking about just a job. I'm talking also about the idea of you also get to have joy, right? You also get to pick up a book and escape into a different world if you want to. Like, why can't you? Like, why aren't you allowed to do that just as much as anybody else? So having that access to joy, having the access to opportunity, is what being able to read and, and your talent, being able to write, give you, open those doors for you in a way that I think one can really feel imbalanced without. And it's not, and I think too that in the meantime, when we're struggling, there's still things we can get through visual media, through audio media. So it's not as though this can happen with students when they're behind. You still give them access in other ways. You make sure that they're, being able to learn about the world in ways that are open and accessible to them. But to be able to build those foundations and to fill in those gaps is really important. And that's why I enjoy the work that I do. I think when you do something that's really systematic, very explicit and well structured and tailored to each student's needs, you will see growth. Like, you see this tremendous growth and things are picked up. And, different kids who are struggling with reading are impacted in different ways. So if you're neurotypical, you're going to have to, it may take you longer, it may take more time, and you may need, like I said earlier, the repeated exposure. But over time, you'll start to see it build. And the places that students will be when you first started to the end will be quite remarkable for them. Whatever that growth means for them, it's going to be different for every student. But yeah, I do see that growth. And even for second language learners, like particularly in China, that class that I taught so long ago, that was my first sort of awakening to how beautiful this change is. Their target language was English, and each of them were coming from their own home languages. And just to watch how rapidly they would pick things up by the end of the year, and they were speaking they were having full-blown conversations in English, and it was remarkable. So and the rates of growth will be different for every child, depending on their needs and their impact, how impacted they are. But it is a true blessing to be able to watch a child grow when they have the nurturing and the goal-oriented learning that they need, that's customized and individual to them. And that's what I do.
Mhm. Yeah. So, and kind of to that end, like I said, I'm not sure if you have any anecdotes. I can give you an example, at least in my case. I guess I wouldn't really call it as much of an aha moment, but it just, I don't know, it sticks out with me with SMART. As you can imagine with these volunteer reading programs, it's skewed towards people, retirees generally, older white people. So usually make up the most of the people reading with these kids. In the school I was working with, it's predominantly Black and brown school. And so, I'm one of the maybe one or two people under, the age of like 50. And usually the only Black male, like, in these programs, just because I'm a freelancer, so I can put that in.
You have that time.
Yeah. But it was funny, like, I remember because prior to COVID, it obviously changed over, but one of the memories that stuck out with me was just I had these two kids, like they'd cycle me. Usually you get set up with like specific kids. Sometimes, if you've been in the program for a while, they'll have you like do doubles or something. But this one day, these two kids were basically like, for lack of better terms, fighting over who gets to read with me. And it was just like,
That's awesome.
Again, you don't want the kids fight. You don't want like actual issues, but at the same time, it's like they're actually excited to,
yes,
do this to that point. It's like, okay, there's something here. And it's, I'm always thinking to myself, like, how can we, again, it's because of the way these programs are set up and just because of time and the economy and whatnot, it's hard. Like most people cannot come in and just like, hey, let me take an hour out of my day in the middle of the morning or in the middle of the afternoon to go to this, and read with these kids. But at the same time, like, how can we, I'm always thinking about like, how can we do these programs? How can we, can we put some funds out there? Can we get something? Because there are people out here who could, touch these kids in just different, in a different way and like really inspire them.
Yes.
And it's also an opportunity to learn, like, the other reason I got involved with SMART, in addition to just being passionate about reading, was just like I want to be able to like get in the school and like learn, how do things work? How's the system operate? Like what are the nuances that I'm missing as just like a reporter, as this outside person, that I can get just from like, not going in there necessarily with this like, yes, I want to, read and hopefully inspire some more, interest in literacy, but also it's not necessarily to like bring in agenda besides that, other than to like learn, I want things to be, I know there's an issue. How are things working? How can things be better? What is it I'm missing? Right. So it's just like, how can we build that, especially in, my mind says, hey, we're in an economic crisis, well, like it's not going to change people's livelihoods to like go read in school for an hour and get paid for it, but the least we could do, of people needing extra money, right?
Right. Why not present the opportunity? I mean, there's so many reasons why that would be a yes, right? So many reasons to put that in the check column, the pro column. Mm-hmm. I mean, one, kids connecting to adults, actually connecting to other human beings, forming a connection, especially when it's someone who either looks like you or you have access to someone who you never would normally see, and then you have to get to have that. That's why I think people of color being in these is so wonderful, because that's why the kids were clamoring after you. I mean, they probably never saw someone come into their school that looked like you. Well, was it downtown in Portland? They might
it was in Portland. It was a school. They do have Black teachers and staff, but like I said, at the same time, in this particular program, I'm the only Black male.
Right, you're the only Black male, and the youngest one too. Yeah, I definitely think so. I think that why wouldn't you? I think we have to stop giving lip service to literacy and how important it is, and start putting the funds where on what we say is important. If we say social justice is important, and we have the opportunity to give work to people of color, and something that we also say is important, why wouldn't you? I mean, it just sort of seems like a win-win situation, and it opens up doors. I mean, this is something high school students could do, right? I mean, why we could give it to high school students, undergraduate students are another population that oftentimes have schedules that might allow for a little more windows of time in there. When I was in undergraduate school, that I was able to go into an elementary school with one schedule I had in the semester, and in that particular program, I wasn't earning money, but if the program had a grant, I'm sure they would have paid us to do it. And I did have an assistantship where I was given board and tuition assistance in NYU. That actually was allowed me to have the assistantship gave me my tuition. I had a full ride there with that assistantship, and then I had to be an RA for board, but in New York you need that. But I mean, these opportunities, but without that, it would have been really a real struggle for me and my family. No loans, the burden of loans afterwards. So I had no loans coming out, and that made a tremendous difference, because having no loans also allowed me to have the freedom to say, well, where would I like to live? What would I like to do? I couldn't have gone to China if I had a whole bunch of loans, because that job was really, that was a low paying job. It basically, they got away with just, this was a private school, so they could actually go a little bit lower. And yeah, so I wouldn't have had that opportunity. And I think, having the finances and the opportunity to having the financial resources to do more things opens up the world to you and allows, and that's part of the problem that I'm seeing right now is that it's not just about what the discrimination. It's like not just about what you don't have access to. It's what that doesn't allow you to do. Like it doesn't allow you the freedom that whatever free is to you is that you cannot go after that. You cannot realize that if you're always struggling and always surviving. And so why not, create win-win situations where people could be paid to do something that we say is important for our kids around literacy and math. You could do the same thing for math. You could have all sorts of math tutors and writing.
Yeah. Some of this like early childhood engagement, I think, plays a role in terms of, our political realities that we just kind of discussed. Because I always wonder, how do you go from, especially like I've learned with like reading with kids, usually they pick like books about dinosaurs and space and cars and all this like, and it's always teaching these lessons about sharing and things that we generally seem positive. So it's like, how do you go from that to this scarcity model? How do you go from that to like buying in? And it kind of gets to this idea we talk about of passively thinking the younger generation is going to be better versus I think it's one of those things where it's like it's active. I think, at least for me, like I'm an agnostic person, but I grew up a United Church of Christ in Ainsworth UCC, and in this idea of an open and affirming church where before I really knew what like gay and lesbian people were, I knew what the conversation around that was. I knew, okay, it's like, before I really understood kind of like these different things, like, oh, okay, I've marched in a gay pride parade. I've kind of like built into like, being around different people and being around these different experiences and like saying, yeah, even if you don't completely, you don't need to like, oh my God, I'm a scholar on different people. I don't need to be a scholar on different groups of people to, believe in humanity and their right to thrive just like mine,
Right.
But like I said, I think that's very, it's intentional. It wasn't just like growing up with these big ideas. It was also growing up directly, not always having to use like metaphors and using the proxies of, again, like dinosaurs and animals, but actually, real people and real experiences. And I think that's one of the things to bring it to LO. And you recently started doing a children's story time with Respond to Racism, organization I volunteer for.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, I'll just tell you, I'm not just saying this because I'm interviewing you. I think it's probably like my favorite part of the programming we do, because it's one, I appreciate just, seeing children's eyes light up and all that. But two, it's also very intentional about engaging young people with, stories of different people, stories of people of color, the experiences, voices. You bring in guest readers. Like it's, it really does, like I said, that intentional work of not just saying, well, if we, throw the ideas and everyone should be treated equally out there, but actually like, no, I'm going to engage you with this. So yeah, can you just talk about that as I mute this because of people outside?
Sound. Yes, it's also, I think, my favorite part of how I participate in anti-racism work as well. Mostly because it's the least traumatizing, like giving the talks around race and particularly to adults and the things we have to talk about with adults. We have to help us, help all of us re-engage with our history and understand our history. And that is extremely, it's brutalizing. And I feel my cortisol levels go up every time I have to prepare a talk for an adult or read things for myself just to, when something new comes out. So getting to do something around the work with children, in which you have to be very careful because it's an early childhood program. I'm very thoughtful around that things are developmentally appropriate, that we're when there are open and explicit books on race and around change, you know, and all the different dimensions that our society is working on. We've had several of those books as well. But it's also, what was important to me is that the conversations around people of color also be one in which children understand that there's not just one type of story that's told. And part of this is what the publishing industry is having to start to learn and turn around, right? That, you know, it's not every time, you know, not all stories took place in the 60s around the civil rights struggle. Like, you know, not all of Black history is around trauma, because that's typically what you'll see. Those are the books that can break through, that the public, you know, once a writer is known for something, if they can write that second one again, and, you know, it will get that same return, maybe that will be. But I think it's starting to push open a lot more. And you're seeing a wider range of representations and a wider range of narratives. And because it's the same, I've seen the same thing with Asian stories. It's a lot on the stories of the immigration process, or the trauma. And without any question, we don't not share those stories. That's not as though those are off the table, nor is it to say those stories are not important. But in like the white community around whiteness, you'll see a much broader range of stories. So there'll be things, so of course there's stories around trauma and hardship, but there's also stories around just that fun summer that we had and what it meant to be a youth. And there's also things around kids who are being imaginative and creative. And I think there are certain publications that do this very, very well. Like I can think of one called Ladybug, which I only started seeing it in 2000, but I'm pretty impressed by the way the representation they would have in that magazine from early on. But I think the publishing industry and books are really becoming better about putting out more stories. And I think Black Lives Matter has really been a big instrument to that. Because I think the larger conversation in the community is that there isn't this monolith, right? We're not a monolith. And part of dismantling the constructs is understanding that we all get to have a different way that we live. We all get to be who we feel we are. Because part of literacy, and what's important around literacy to me too, is identity. Like you being able to absorb and learn your identity through these different mediums and deciding who you want to be, rather than some external construct being formed and putting you in a box. And I think what the selections that I've tried my best to find, and it's fun exploring them because there's a lot out there, but you have to also find, I try to make them around certain themes. But we've had things on astronauts, we've had things on cowboys, people of color who what else have we done? It's all escaping me. Can't remember some of the other ones. I've avoided right now things around entertainment because I think we get a lot, like that's where a lot of people are put, and the history behind that is very interesting. But just, science, we've done things around STEM, of course. So for me, finding new types of stories that haven't been told around people who aren't often seen is really interesting, and it's less it's less done. There's very popular books that you'll see come into the classrooms over and over again. And I certainly don't avoid those, but trying to find like stories and themes that might not come into the classroom is interesting to me. Like my next one, what I'm trying to find right now are things on pirates, like they're Black pirates. I did one on bird watching. That one was of course inspired by our Central Park incident. So I did a whole story thing around birding and found a great book put out on birders of color. You know, this young girl who's a person of color, who another person of color introduces her to the world of bird watching. And so we had things around that. So sometimes it's inspired by the narratives and conversations that are happening, and then that will inform like what will come up. Finding people and places and ideas that people don't associate people of color with, right? Like things they don't typically associate them with. And or just things that I think are beautiful, like a book that's beautiful or a storyline that's beautiful, and then centering things around that. I think we're trying to make it weekly now, which will change the prep time is going to have to be a lot faster. But I do feel it's really important that children of color and white children, all children, see children of color in many different ways, and not always hurt or burdened or being pushed down, because you don't want the internalized message to be that there's a particular place and for children of color, and this is where it always is. I think we have to break free of this notion that there's only one story. So yeah, it's so great to be in that. And I read a lot of different blogs on people commenting on things and how they view different books. I read interesting blogs on that to try to find books too. But yeah, it's very enjoyable. I'm with you on that.
Yeah, you know, it's like I said, it's my favorite.
Yeah,
Sorry,
it's really nice that you do it.
Sorry, my thing just kind of went back to the unstable thing, so I don't know if it stopped. I figured I'd just hold off and just say, you know, this will require a little bit more editing, but all right. Anyways, yeah, no, yeah, like I said, it's probably my favorite part. Like, you know, I don't even just to like tune in and just, you know, watch, you know, see the selections, but then also just see the way the kids interact with it, you know, answering questions, sharing their thoughts. You know, sometimes you have like, whether it's your daughter, sometimes other students who, you know, young kids who do a little bit of guest reading, and it's like, oh man, this is what, you know, obviously there's other work too, but like this, you know, it's just, it gives you, like you said, it's that it's just, it's so much more almost, probably, I'm probably using the wrong word when I say restorative, but honestly, like it just, it feels something in you.
Yes, you feel hopeful. I feel hopeful. You know, the number of kids who come on varies a lot, and I have a feeling that now we're going to back to in-person schooling. I'd be curious to see what the numbers are, because the days for families are filling up more. But I will say that there's a very the kids who come on, I'm not surprised, you know, by their reactions, because I've been in the classroom so much, and I see that children, you know, what you're talking to is the idea of the adults. We have to keep being vigilant and not just being complacent around the messaging, and being very thoughtful about the messaging that kids are getting from their environment around race, and giving children and all of us, especially adults, the language to talk about racism and discrimination and prejudice in ways that can move the conversation forward and make us alert and aware. And in the meantime, the kids who are coming on, and maybe it's because it's already sort of like a hyper selective audience, you know, but they're there, you know, they're there, and you almost feel like they're open, they're reacting. Unfortunately, because I'm having to present in full screen, I can't see them all the time. with the way that because I'm the main moderator, I can't see their faces. So it wasn't until I had a guest reader on and I could turn on gallery view that I could see them, and it was lovely. And so that's only happened one time in the 7 months we've been doing it. But yeah, I think that, like you said, this is a generational thing. You know, changing the outcome for racism and prejudice is generational. But I think the gay rights movement has really shown us that it can go faster than one thinks. I think racism will take longer. I think racism will take a lot longer than the gay rights movement. But something interesting too is that another type of issue is ageism, and that also apparently will take a long time as well, which was really striking to me. But I do agree with you that finding ways to put it in front of the children very explicitly, like the adults have to be conscious of giving them this knowledge and opening it to them starting very young is really important. And also understanding that as communities, we have to understand. I was recently giving a talk on this, on how children learn about racism. And it's not always just the parents, right? So we often think of children who are making racist remarks or statements that there's something their parents have done, but it can be the entire community. You know, your entire society is giving you messages all the time. And children learn biases very young. And so in the United States, the biases happen to be around racism, but like CAST shows in this paper that I often have read, talks about, is that bias is whatever you're living in, that bias is going to be towards whatever hierarchy exists. So children learn very young who's privileged in a community and who's not. And their natural desire is, it's not so much about not wanting to be with the group that's lower, it's wanting to be associated with the group that has more. So it's not even so much a blatant discrimination the way that it is with adults. It's more about how they've learned where the privileges will be, and so who they would like to be. And so bias is very interesting. So that's why bias is a really powerful, it's a broader word, but you know, you'll see it because bias, you'll have bias with class, you'll have bias, there's an intersectionality there that I think is more comprehensive. But certainly around race, children learn very, very early, by preschool on. In fact, when they're infants, children can distinguish between races, but between the phenotype, right? So they'll know when someone of another race that is unfamiliar to them comes in front of them. At 6 months, an infant will see them and will know that this person is different in some way. And so races, they're able to distinguish between the races at a very young age as infants. But once they start to get to preschool age and older, that's when they're starting to connect messages around race, right? They're absorbing what people believe around race to the phenotype. So before it was just, this person's different phenotypically, but now the messages are being connected to it. So that's where it starts to become really important that you directly and explicitly talk to them about race and discrimination and all of those things. And it doesn't have to be a constant conversation. You also put in front of them the low-hanging fruit is, like, to me, the story times, right? The stories, the narratives that you put in front of them. Those are the ways that you can create conversation in a sort of an organic way. So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, like I said, favorite time of the month with RTR. But anyways, I think, I know you gotta go. So I want to thank you again for coming on today. And just for, like, if people want to learn more about your business, want to learn more about the story times, can you just tell them where to find that info?
Oh, yes. Thank you. That's really kind of you. My work for getting tutoring, you can go to www.klpliteracy.com. And for the story times, the respondtoracism.org website has on the events page, it will share the times, the days and times to register. And you have to register, and then the night before the story time, they'll send out the Zoom password for anyone who wants to join. And it's right now, the age group is around kindergarten to grade 3 is about what the story selection is targeting. But any age, of course, is welcome. And you'd be surprised by the number of adults. And afterwards, they'll say, we learned so much. So everybody's absorbing. So it's awesome. It's a nice community.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks again, Katharine Phelps, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Bruce. You too. Thank you so much.